the state's chief medical examiner, was humiliated and arrested, only because of his skin color. The officer had no idea who he really was. When the truth came to light, the consequences shook the entire city. What happened next will surprise even the most seasoned readers. But let's start from the beginning. Dr. Derek Maxwell, the state's chief medical examiner, was finishing a late workday. A 42-year-old black man with short black hair and confident brown eyes, he was known for his dedication to seeing every case through. Nearing his home, he decided to stop by a small store for groceries. The streets were nearly empty, and the dark had settled over the city, creating a quiet but tense atmosphere. Dressed in casual clothes, jeans, a dark shirt, and a light jacket, Derek looked like any other shopper. As he left the store with 2 bags of groceries, a young white police officer, Officer Jackson, 25, approached him. Jackson, new to the precinct, was eager to prove himself, but often acted on biased stereotypes. Jackson abruptly stopped Derek, frowning and suspiciously eyeing his bags. He claimed Derek was acting strangely, though Derek was only standing there holding his groceries. Jackson's expression revealed distrust, and he immediately demanded that Derek show identification and explain what he was doing in the area. Derek, deeply insulted yet keeping his cool, pulled out his ID, hoping to avoid a confrontation. But Jackson, ignoring Derek's ID and explanations, pushed further. Unaware of whom he was dealing with, Jackson began rifling through Derek's grocery bags despite Derek's pleas to stop. The officer escalated the situation, accusing him of suspicious behavior. Hurt flashed in Derek's eyes, but he maintained his composure, knowing his dignity was at stake. Jackson, convinced he was dealing with a potential criminal, pulled out his handcuffs and without a second thought, snapped them onto Derek's wrists. The humiliation began. Derek, the state's chief medical examiner, stood handcuffed on the street, surrounded by a few onlookers who watched with shock and confusion. Some began recording the scene on their phones, while Derek felt his status and professional achievements meant nothing to the police simply because of his skin color. To Officer Jackson, Derek was merely a black man with grocery bags, someone he found suspicious enough to handcuff. At that moment, Derek realized he was up against a system where stereotypes could overshadow a person's identity. Disregarding Derek's protests, Officer Jackson led him toward the patrol car across the empty parking lot. Derek's hands were bound, and he struggled to conceal the anger and humiliation building inside. A few passers-by stopped, astonished by the scene, whispering and filming what looked like an arrest. The sight of a black man in handcuffs stirred suspicions, and some seemed to make up their minds with just a glance. "This is a mistake," Derek said calmly, though his voice shook with restrained anger. "I am the state's chief medical examiner. You can verify my identity." Yet Jackson, still seeing only a suspicious person, coldly smirked, assuming this was another attempt to dodge the law. "Oh, now you're someone important, huh?" Jackson sneered dismissively. "I've heard that one before. Suspicious types always find stories to get out of trouble." As Jackson loaded him into the patrol car, another police vehicle pulled into the lot. Out stepped Lieutenant Rodriguez, an experienced officer, a white man around 45 with a stern, weary expression. Hearing about a suspicious detainee, he came to ensure proper procedures were followed, but his expression changed the instant he saw Derek. Rodriguez recognized him. The man who had helped police investigations countless times now stood before him, handcuffed, visibly outraged and humiliated. Lieutenant Rodriguez swiftly approached Jackson and ordered him to remove the handcuffs. Jackson froze, bewildered, and stared at his superior in confusion. "This is a mistake," Rodriguez spoke sternly but evenly, removing Derek's cuffs. "Do you know who this is? This is Dr. Derek Maxwell, our chief medical examiner." Momentarily speechless, Jackson paled as he realized he'd humiliated someone of immense integrity without a second thought. He opened his mouth to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. As people around them continued recording, some began to recognize Derek, murmuring his name and realizing they were witnessing a blatant injustice. One bystander spoke up loudly, "This is just disgraceful!" Jackson stood, struggling to justify himself to Rodriguez, but his face burned with shame at his mistake. Rodriguez apologized to Derek, who, barely containing his frustration, understood that an apology wouldn't be enough in a system that allowed such an incident to happen. The next day, as expected, the video of Derek Maxwell's arrest went viral on social media. Footage of the state's chief medical examiner standing handcuffed in a dark parking lot, ignored by a young white officer, sparked a wave of public outrage. Thousands of furious and supportive comments flooded social media, and local news immediately picked up the story, describing the incident as a flagrant example of racial discrimination. Under pressure from the public and media, the police department launched an internal investigation. Officer Jackson was temporarily suspended, but was scheduled to appear before a special commission. Lieutenant Rodriguez was also called as a witness and received a reprimand for inadequate oversight of his subordinates' actions. Understanding the gravity of the situation, the department's leadership resolved not only to investigate, but to implement a program to train staff on preventing racial bias. Meanwhile, Derek, seething with indignation after the arrest, resolved to fight for change. Through his story, he hoped to bring awareness to a systemic issue. During a press conference organized by police representatives, he addressed the public and authorities. "This case is not just one person's mistake," Derek said firmly into the microphone, looking out at the audience and into the camera broadcasting his words live. "It reflects a systemic problem where skin color alone raises suspicion. We all deserve respect, no matter where we work or who we are. The system should not undermine its own credibility." His words drew supportive applause, and some reporters sharply questioned the police leadership about steps to prevent such incidents in the future. Jackson, seated in the audience, watched with a pang of guilt, now realizing his actions were rooted in deeply ingrained stereotypes within both himself and the system he served. The police leadership announced plans to establish new standards, requiring officers to treat all citizens with respect and caution, regardless of appearance. For Jackson, this incident was a turning point, forcing him to confront and abandon the biases that had led to humiliation and injustice. A week after the incident, public interest in Derek's case and the police did not wane. Pressured by the community, the department's leadership issued a formal apology, mandated training for all officers, including Officer Jackson, and introduced reforms aimed at combating racial bias. At a special ceremony organized by the police department, Lieutenant Rodriguez publicly apologized to Derek. In his speech, he acknowledged the department's mistakes and confirmed its commitment to change. Derek stood beside him, maintaining a serious and reserved expression, though his eyes showed respect for Rodriguez, who, despite the challenges, had taken steps toward reconciliation and reform. Later, Officer Jackson himself stepped onto the stage. The young white man, shoulders slumped and face guilty, had faced criticism from both colleagues and citizens since the incident. This was a defining moment for him. Gathering himself, he turned to Derek, his voice slightly trembling. "Dr. Maxwell," Jackson said, looking directly into Derek's eyes, "I apologize. I was wrong to judge you by your appearance. I've learned a lot and am ready to change my behavior." Derek listened carefully. Seeing the sincerity in the young officer's face, he nodded slightly and extended his hand. This handshake became a symbol of reconciliation, and the crowd applauded, understanding the profound meaning in this simple gesture. After the ceremony, Derek returned home feeling he'd achieved a significant outcome, not only for himself, but for the entire community. News of his arrest and his fight for justice reached media outlets nationwide, sparking a discussion on racial bias in law enforcement. The state police department adopted a program focused on reducing prejudice and improving understanding between officers and citizens. Back at work, Derek felt that his story had become an example of the importance of fighting for justice. The looks directed at him had changed. He was respected not only as a professional, but as someone who stood up for the truth and prompted the system to change.